Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As always, we thank you for joining us on our YouTube and Facebook pages. The last time you saw us, we were reflecting on Anthony Joseph's The Frequency of Magic. Today, we will be interviewing Anthony Joseph. Welcome, Anthony.
Hi.
Hi. It's a
Hello.
pleasure to have
Good to
you.
be here.
Yes. So I guess I could jump right into it. So last week, our discussion focused on sort of the mechanics of your novel and the themes that you sort of, if I
Mhm.
could say it, included within your novel. So
Yeah.
the question I have for you is, why did you choose surrealism, and is that choice in any way connected to Caribbean people's frequent, only half joking complaint that this island is not a real place? And I'm sure you've heard that many times with your home country.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with surrealism, uh, Andre Breton, who was the sort of founder and the leader of the surrealist movement, drew a lot of his inspiration for surrealism from African art, African painting, Indonesian painting and art. So surrealism, existed in some form way before the surrealist movement as a literary movement was founded. And I think that we could find evidence of surrealism in a lot of African storytelling, and that gets translated into Caribbean storytelling. The way we tell stories in Trinidad and the Caribbean, sometimes magical things just happen. So I grew up. That's the sort of environment that I grew up in. Going to the Baptist church and seeing, really interesting things happening that couldn't be explained. Unexplainable events. And then we have Carnival, which is, a whole surrealist festival. It's a festival of surrealism in some way.
Mm.
So I'm drawing on that, that later became something that the literary world called surrealism. But I'm drawing on a really primal, sort of traditional way of storytelling in which magical things happen. Um, and the more you sort of drill down into that and try to tell a Caribbean story, you have to include elements of that. You have to include some sort of magical realism or some sort of surrealism, because that is in the air. That is how we live and breathe in the Caribbean. Magical things happen. So that's where it comes from. So in a way, it chose me by just trying to be true to the material and trying to be true to the stories I was trying to tell and the stories that were passed down to me. Um, Being true to them meant that some sort of magical element was incorporated into it.
And I suppose this is the way stories are typically told in the Caribbean. You go to the marketplace, you sit on your grandparents' step or anywhere in
Yeah,
the village, and the way they sort of exaggerate things. I
yeah,
suppose there's no way you could evade that in your own storytelling.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So I've always tried to include that, or just be true to it. It's just to be true to the way we tell stories. I always find that, especially in Trinidad, I mean, we can talk about this later, but there's a sense that there is no sort of linear time in the way that you expect time to go in a linear way. This happens, then that happens. It feels like everything's happening at the same time. It feels like stuff is happening on top of each other, and you're getting sort of a multiple kind of experience going on. Um, and that kind of breaks with what people expect of a linear story. So just trying to include all of that brings you into a really kind of, I guess, what people call experimental way of storytelling. But for us, it's not experimental. It's just being true to actually how the experience of the Caribbean is. I can
Paula?
talk a bit more about that. I mean, if you look at Erna Broadbent's work, she tries to capture that. You know, especially in Meal, there's a sense of everything happening at the same time. Anyway, we're onto
Yeah, I'm
something
a
else.
big Broadway fan myself, so
Okay,
I did
okay,
notice the Broadway. A kind of,
yeah,
I think you even mentioned her in the novel. I think you
yeah, I did. Yeah,
specifically
yeah, yeah,
mentioned her in the novel.
yeah,
But
yeah,
on
yeah,
the
yeah.
whole issue of surrealism, early in the novel, the narrator tells us that Raphael's novel wouldn't done, that the plot
Mm,
won't drive straight, and that the people
hmm.
inside the book getting damn vexed and restless. How how much of that was meant to prepare us for the surrealist journey, as opposed to you just having fun about the pitfalls of writing?
Well, the book is metafiction. It's fiction that is self-conscious. So you're aware that you're reading a writer writing a book. But what I like is that it's what I call the mirror of infinity. You're not actually sure who you're reading. So if you're reading the writer writing a book, then what are you actually reading? Because the writer is in the process of writing it, and Raphael never reads back. He just keeps going forward. So who are you actually reading? Are you reading the author? Who is the author? Are you reading Raphael? How could you be reading Raphael if he's still writing the process? So I found that a really playful space. I really enjoyed that. So that beginning that you talk about is actually something that I borrowed from Lovelace. In the beginning of Salt, he talks about how, if you look at the landscape of the island, you would see that these people could not essentially be colonized. They were too hardened, they're too stubborn. You tell them do one thing, they do something else. It's a place where the rain decide when it wants to fall. And he goes into that for about a whole page. He talks about the sort of the difficulty that colonialists had to colonize the Caribbean, in Trinidad in particular. So I kind of draw on that and use it as a sort of a metaphor for storytelling. How, if your story is, if your characters are really drawn well and you bring them to life in a strong way, they resist what you want them to do, and that is a point where you're doing good work when the character says, no, I don't want to go there, I want to stay here, or I want to do this, or I don't want to say that, and you feel that resistance. I think that's a great point, and I wanted to use that as a place to work with metafiction, to say, okay, these characters have come fully alive, they're fully rebelling against whatever this author is trying to do. They have their own lives, and that is where I get the inspiration to do the structure of the novel in the way it is.
Well, thank you for it, because I personally really enjoyed seeing that. I know lots of authors have talked about how the characters exist in their heads and they just write what the characters tell
Mm,
them. But what you have is a
yeah,
situation where your characters come alive and they tell you one thing perhaps, and then you go in a different direction and they come back against you. And it was wonderful
yeah,
to read. So thank you so much.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I think pulling on also what you said about Lovelace, which is that
Mm,
in the book, sorry, not just now, there's a part where you talk about, he says, that every character you write is in some way you. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't think that's
yeah,
exactly how it's written in the book.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in that case, to what extent is Raphael or the musician you? There's a kind of question that pops out.
I don't I think it's no, I don't think it's me. I think it's a good question, but I learned a long time ago that any character you create has probably four elements. There's an element of you in it. There's definitely some of your biography, some of your experience in your characters. Of course, otherwise you can't flesh them out. So there's an element of you, there's an element of something you just make up, somebody you just, traits that you just make up, and there's also things that are based on other people that there's elements of your character that that might be part of your uncle or you're part of your mom. You draw on certain traits, and then there's another element which is a combination of everything. It's a combination of, some characters are a bit of what I know of my own self, a bit of what people have told me about other people, a bit of people I know. So it's a fusion. It's a fusion going on. So yes, there are elements of Raphael that are definitely me. Absolutely. There's definitely some experiences that I talk about, especially the more sort of craft-based things where he's actually crafting the book, and he's trying to formulate the narrative and trying to write the book. Yeah, that's definitely elements of me. But I didn't grow up in the sort of environment that he grew up in. I didn't grow up in a village on a hill. I didn't. That's somebody else. That's another experience that I'm drawing on. That's my family, elements of my family experience that I'm drawing on. The musician it's quite similar. There's a lot more sort of correlation between me as my individual self as a person and the musician, because I was also, I've done that. I've done that whole touring thing. I still do it. I still work with a band and tour, and I draw on a lot of that for structural elements, not necessarily the details. A lot of the stuff that I talk about with the musician experiences, they're things that I make up. They're fiction, but they're based on experiences that I might have had, traveling through France, that I draw on in a kind of magical or tangential way. Like there's a scene where I talk about driving through rain, and the rain is like, really hard rain, and the band is traveling and they go to this other city. That didn't actually happen that way, but you draw on certain details, and that's fiction. That's what a writer does, you know.
Thank you.
Just to sort of go on what you last mentioned there, because in our reflections we sort of had I would call it a lengthy discussion on the whole character of the Jazzman character, and the
Mm,
way that the novel portrayed them in terms of their vices, their indiscretions, their indignations, even.
yeah,
So I was
yeah,
wondering
yeah.
whether, that was sort of a deliberate self-reflection or a rebuke of the sort of jazzman culture. Um, what's your take on that?
Nah,
Was it a
I think
reflection or a
what
rebuke? Yeah.
I find that I like extremes. I like extremes in writing. I like to push things as far as it could go. In terms of the frequency of magic, I knew I was going to write something that was going to be controversial in places, that was going to be explicit, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to do that and take the risk of doing that, because I think very little of Caribbean fiction has that element. We're a lot of times we're very, very conservative, and I decided I was going to push against that and be, sort of Marquis de Sade, take things really far. So a lot of the stuff that the jazz musician experiences, or the way he acts towards women, for instance, is really an extreme version that is deliberately extreme. It's deliberately challenging. I want to do that. I know it's risky, but I wanted to do that. I wanted to capture that particular mindset in a way that is, exposing it to critique as well as just exposing it for what it is. So, he does. No one in the novel comes. No one in the novel ends the novel in a good way. Everyone suffers. Everyone, pays for who they are in some way, even the jazz musicians. So I wanted to do that. I didn't want to praise his indiscretions, but I wanted to be honest about them and say this is who he was. This is who he is. And there are people like that, you know. So I was just trying to be true to the characters in an extreme, real way, you know.
It's
Mission
interesting you
accomplished.
say it's interesting you say that he was extreme, because I know the jazz man and I don't find him atypical at all. I know him very well, and I know quite a few a few of him. But on the matter of characters, um,
Yeah,
this novel, The Frequency of Magic, has a massive cast of characters.
yeah, yeah.
When writing the novel, were there any of the characters in whom you were particularly invested? And if so, whom and why?
I mean, all of them, I liked all of them. I especially liked, well, not especially, but I liked the bandit, the great bandit. I just had fun writing his character and, drawing on that sort of humor, the overweight assassin is a motif that I used in my other novel, the African Origins of the UFOs. There's a guy in there called Bo Nuggy, who's also like this huge wrestler type assassin. I just like that. I just think that's funny, and I think that's probably drawn on my stepfather, who was a similar kind of figure, who was kind of big and old Trini man with a big belly, and I kind of draw on that a lot for that the Midnight Rubber as well. So I was drawn to him as a character. I was also, of course, drawn to Raphael because Raphael is a writer, and Raphael is kind of modeled on people that I actually knew, people in my family. He's drawn on an uncle of mine called Christopher, who lived in a place called Malik, who was, a really important figure for me in terms of storytelling and characterization. So I drew on him, and I drew on a lot of people to sort of create Raphael. But yeah, Raphael, um, the bandit. I mean, all of them in some way. Luke. You know, um, yeah. It's hard to choose. You know.
Sometimes people say it's like choosing between their children, so we won't make you do such a difficult thing.
Mm. I mean, Bane as well. Bane is an interesting character that I had fun writing. Bane, who's
Raphael's
I think
brother.
Raphael's brother. Yeah, Bane was interesting. That was drawn on my, I used my sort of experience with my brother for a lot with that, and many different people. But Bane was a complex character for me, one of the most sort of complex characters in the book. Anyway.
Mm. Um, Random question, perhaps, but must be asked. Oil comes up a lot. People are gonna die and become oil. But it's kind of a motif that comes up again and again in the novel. And I couldn't get it. I was like, what is this thing about oil? I'm like, is it because Trinidad's made of oil? Like the economy is built on oil? Like, what's the reference to oil about? Can you please
You know,
enlighten me? Like, it's a
I
very
don't
personal
actually
question.
know.
Nobody
I don't
cares, but
actually
I
know.
do.
I don't actually know. I mean, I'm interested in. Oh gosh, I mean, I think it has to do for me. When you mention people die and become oil and all that, there's something about the human body and the way it decays that is that has a relationship to oil for me. There's something, I mean, without getting too grotesque or whatever. Um, the times that I've heard about people, deceased people and dead bodies and stuff like that, there's always this element of oil, an oil aspect, that oil seeping out of the body in some way, some sort of, yeah. So that is, yeah, I'm kind of interested in that. So I don't know if that is what it is, but if you say that it's a motif that is all through the book, I don't know. It's not something intentional. Maybe it's kind of unconscious that it's there. Maybe I need a psychotherapist or something. I don't know.
It wasn't a bad thing. It was a curious thing that I noticed. I was like,
Yeah,
that's really interesting that oil keeps coming back in unusual ways. It's not often you see people, like people often talk about turning to
yeah.
dust when they die, but you had them turn into oil. And I was like, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
I
thank
don't
you.
know. I don't know. It's one of the mysteries.
And then a sort of another motif that we picked upon that we discussed in our reflections was the sort of gory details of
Mm.
open sores. Like one of the characters had like a huge sore on her foot or something like that. So was that another deliberate thing, or it was just sort of unconscious? Like I remember growing up and a lot of the elderly people had diabetes and diabetic sores. Was it deliberate, or was it unconscious that you just
It's
kept mentioning
No,
it?
it's not unconscious. It's deliberate in the sense that it's drawing on, as you sort of grow up, and you have experiences as a child. Some of the experiences you have as a young child are the things which really stay in your mind, that they become motifs that you return to over and over again as a writer. So I talk about the savannah a lot because that was a really powerful motif for me growing up. I talk about the sore that wouldn't heal because when I was a child, I used to go to the Baptist church with my grandparents, and one of the mothers of the church, whose name I forget now, but she had a what we would call a sore foot, which was she had an open wound that wouldn't heal, And I remember my grandmother talking about it to me and saying, "Yeah, she sore foot doesn't heal." And people used to make jokes about her, and they used to say various things about her and what she used to, It was kind of a weird thing that was going on with her and her foot. And I remember being really fascinated by it, and that stayed with me. So that motif of the sore that doesn't heal stays, and it appears in pretty much all the fiction that I write. It appears in some way. It's one of those things that it's a motif that stays. Um, Later, of course, I learned that is actually syphilis. It's actually a symptom of syphilis. Yeah, and of course, that has relationships to people in the Caribbean in the 70s who maybe couldn't afford medical care, or couldn't afford decent sort of diagnosis of what was going on. So we just knew that she had a sore foot, but it turns out that it was syphilis. And my cousin, not my cousin actually, my cousin-in-law died from that. He had the same sort of thing. He had a wound on his foot that wouldn't heal, and eventually it killed him. So these things, yeah, uncomfortable motifs, but yeah, real. They stay with me. I'm I guess, the kind of writer that wouldn't censor that. I would have embrace it and include it in the work. Yeah.
I want to take you into a more pleasant direction now.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
Raphael, like you, is writing a
Yeah.
novel entitled The Frequency of Magic. And the saxophonist breaks bread to find the frequency of magic. The
Yeah.
omniscient narrator tells us that a poem is the frequency of magic. Are those
Mm.
references to frequency references to sound waves as opposed to numerical frequency, or are they both? And are words and music the magic which are the concerns of the novel, or is magic larger than sound? That's a lot. I know
Wow.
I put a lot into that
Wow.
question.
That's beautiful. The frequency of magic is the first time I used that phrase was when Amiri Baraka passed, the poet, the Black American poet. When he passed, I was on a bus. I was coming from teaching. I was teaching in London. I was coming home, and I opened the news and I found that he died. And I just started writing spontaneously. And one of the things that I wrote was, had I have known that he had died, I would have spoken to my class about it, and I would have told them about the frequency of his use of the frequency of magic. And it just came to me as a phrase. Um, and then later on, I kind of tried to understand what it was I was trying to say. And what I was trying to say was, it was in reference to one of his poems, which is called Preface to a Suicide, or something like that, where he talks about his daughter, um, who counts the stars every night, and when they will not come, she counts the holes they leave. And I thought that is such an amazing idea, and it's a frequency of magic. But Baraka has achieved, or he has narrowed in on a particular frequency of. You read that line and you think it's magical. She counts the holes they leave. It's magical. And I started thinking about magic and magic and magic, and I came to the understanding that when a magician does a trick, or a card trick, or when he saws the woman in half or whatever and opens the thing and you see these two parts, in that moment there is a suspension of belief. You're like, it's a wow moment. It's like, you know later on, after a few seconds, you can work it out. You're like, okay, so this is a trick, and blah blah blah. It's a trick. But in that moment when the trick happens, for that couple of seconds, you're in a magical space in which anything is possible. And that is the frequency of magic. And I think that good poetry does that. A poet is constantly trying to find moments like that, where they transport the reader, or where they take the ground away from the reader, and the reader just feels, wow, an overwhelming sense of wonder. So that for me is the frequency of magic. So it's a frequency. It's like tuning in a radio to find a particular point where magic is occurring. That's what it is. That's what it is to me, and that's how I try to teach as well. I try to tell students, you got to find that moment, find that point where magic is happening in the work, where you're going beyond what just is on the page and you're into something completely different. But usually, to get to that point, it's really difficult. You have to forget yourself. You have to get out of your own way. And, it's like a jazz musician when they're completely improvising and they're in the zone. They're in the frequency. They're in a frequency of magic. They're not thinking. They're just doing and existing in that space. So that's the frequency. So I don't know if that helps to, answer in some way. The last part of your question, though, repeat that for me, please.
Are words and music the magic which are the concerns of the novel, or is magic larger than sound?
Wow. I think I want to say yes to both of those points. I think, in one level, I'm a poet, so working in this novel, working in this form was an exercise in poetry for me. It's not necessarily, it's a work of fiction, but it's written in a poetic way. It's, every word has to earn its place. There's 1,000 words per each chapter, so it's approached in the way a poet would write it. So it's definitely, the magic of the words and the sound is really important to me. Of course, it's the heart of the book and the heart of everything I do. But is magic more? I think that in itself is a magical question, which I don't know the answer to. I think.
Poet speaking to poet. That's what happened
Yeah,
there.
yeah, that's what it is. It's all
Lovely.
magic.
Um, oh, I feel like I'm going to take it in a different direction now, but maybe I won't. Like,
That's
it's supposed
good.
to be a
That's
nice
good.
question, but maybe it's a nasty question. I don't know. We'll see how you respond. You'll
Ooh,
decide. Um, I think as a female reader, when I first started reading the novel, I was really jarred by the lack of
mhm.
interiority of the female characters, and
Yeah.
I think on both reread and reflection, um, I actually think that the question of interiority or the lack of interiority for the female characters sort of resolves itself when we see that the musician is unable to love. He's unable to fully
Mhm.
see the women around him as human, and that kind of explains what has jarred me for the most of the novel, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's
Yeah.
kind of okay, but it is still relatively controversial as a choice, right? It
Yeah.
does feel very misogynistic for most of the novel. Um,
Yeah.
and it's and you kind of explain that misogyny, but it doesn't stop it from hurting in the first part, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm.
But when one woman's name jumps out at me, that and I just have to ask, like Yvette Cooper,
Mm.
like you've got this like salutation in the arc, I think, where all the kind of greats of the Caribbean go, right? And Yvette Cooper goes with it. So, you
Yeah.
know, as a Brit, I'm like, the would-be leader of the Labour Party? Like, is there a different Yvette Cooper I don't know about? Has he got like a soft spot for this random liberal white woman? Um,
Not at
like, what's
all.
going on with that? So
Not at
there's two
all.
different things going on there. Like both, like how did you? I think I'm question. The question is, have you had much backlash from female readers? Have men responded differently? Has it come up or has it not in terms of people talking about the misogyny in the novel, or have other people also felt it's resolved itself and so it kind of hasn't provoked a lot of questions for you as an author? And
Um,
also, why get it Cooper?
Yvette Cooper. I'll start with Yvette Cooper. Yvette Cooper is just a name. It's just a name. I mean, when I was growing up, there were lots of women called Yvette and Daphne and Cynthia. It
Mhm.
was a kind of traditional sort of name field in, growing up in the 70s. You had a lot of women called. It's a quintessential Caribbean name, I think. So that's what I draw on, and I sort of, she's a compound character made of different characters. Um, the thing about the misogyny and stuff, I've had different levels of feedback about that. Um, on one level, I think that um, it was always going to be a challenge for me to sort of completely get it right. A lot of times. So, I don't think I got it completely right. I don't think I got the female characters completely right. I did what I could at that time. What I was trying to do was to be true to a particular aesthetic, a particular way of storytelling, a particular attitude that certain of the characters might have had in the book towards women, and to be true to that. But as you say, it kind of resolves itself in the sense that no one comes out well. No one comes out well. Even the men that are misogynistic suffer greatly. The women suffer greatly. Everyone suffers. So, while I'm aware that, yeah, you're right. There's a lack of interiority to a lot of the women. I tried to get a sense of interiority with the actor. You know, I think she's a sort of more significant character, and actually, when I was writing it, I gave it to a few of my friends, female friends. I gave it to a Trinidadian writer, um, and who, because I expected she would come back and say, "Hey, this is, you can't do this." But she was like, "No, I think we need space for this, even though it's challenging, it's hard. I think we need it. We need space for it. I think it's fine. I wasn't that offended by it. I think it was necessary to do because it is true. It's reflective of a particular kind of attitude. Um, so yeah, that's what I try to do. I don't profess to be someone that is going to absolutely nail it and get that right. But I tried, and yeah, you know, that's it. I mean, I think
So,
what I express is definitely the attitude of a particular generation of Caribbean men. You know, that was definitely the sort of attitudes that I grew up around, and which later I was able with maturity and experience to challenge myself. But growing up in the early '70s or in the mid '70s, hey, that was that's what I heard. That's what I saw.
Yeah, I think it is. I do think it's hard to read. I think as a woman but I think it does work, kind of in terms of literary devices, if you like you say, it does express
Right.
and it does express a particular mindset, and I think it does within the novel resolve itself, and it makes sense in the context of metafiction, where we can imagine Raphael writing a novel like this, right? Where it's all,
Mm-hmm.
I think Eric described it as
Yeah.
this really classic toxic masculinity. They're all fighting each other. Somebody must dead.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, and you talk about the need for action, right? So I
Yeah.
think it works. I just
Mm-hmm.
was curious to see, what the response had been. Thank you so much for your answer.
Mm. It is a tough one. It's a tough one.
I'm really glad where you took your answer, especially towards the end there, Anthony, because I know you mentioned it was a reflection of the attitudes, and then you added,
Mm-hmm.
it was a reflection of the generations, because that's sort of the discussion we had as well, and
Mm-hmm.
my sort of thinking in terms it was a reflection of the period within which the novel, well, it's set over 41 years, but it's a reflection of the period where the novel begins, essentially. And I don't remember in my read of the novel there was sort of like an explicit statement of the year, or like
Mm-hmm.
to say, for example, like 1979 or 1981,
Sure.
but throughout the novel you kept mentioning the post-colonial hospital, which I assume is Port of Spain General,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the fact that you referred to it as the post-colonial hospital sort of gave a hint towards the period you were thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be in the
Yeah.
2000s. It would be more like immediately after the Trinidad and Tobago gained its independence.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so just in terms of, am I right? Am I on the right track in terms of the time period that you set this novel in terms of marking it with the post-colonial hospital, etc.?
I think you're right. I think I don't set it in any particular time, because I like a lot of my sort of fiction to be timeless, to sort of exist in a space that is, you can't really pin the time down. Um, so I like that. I like to do that as a writer. But I think if I was to choose a time when kind of Raphael was writing and the village life was going on, it would be the '80s. It would be the early '80s, because the place where Raphael lives is modeled very heavily on a place in Trinidad called Malik, which is where my father's family they have a little village of their own in the hills, and I spent a lot of time, and that's a really sort of um, uh, really important space for me, spiritually as well as sort of aesthetically. So I drew a lot on that experience of going there in the '80s, and talking about that village life. That's where I learned a lot of it. So it would be the '80s, but I don't think it's set in any particular time, especially because we're dealing with a musician as well who's traveling through in a very contemporary way, traveling through Europe, an actor who's in New York and kind of contemporary times. So yeah, it's not. I try not to pin it to a particular point in time.
That that answer is interesting to me for more than one reason. Um, I'm almost certain I see a reference to the 1980s in the novel.
Hmm.
You're the
Yeah.
writer, you wrote it, you have to know better than me. But I was almost certain I saw a direct reference to the 1980s. And
Yeah.
the reference, now that you mentioned Malik, no, I've
Hmm.
been reading your poems, sonnets for Albert, and I saw
Okay.
a reference to Malik, and I thought Malik was a person. So
Mm.
no, that clears that up for me. But
Yeah.
we're not discussing sonnets for Albert here. So let me get back to the frequency of magic. The
Okay.
novel salutes several notable musicians as well as certain Caribbean writers.
Hmm.
Why was that important to you? And as an aside, is there a subtle nod to the film The Harder They Come in the reference to the possibility of a Starboy's death in the last reel?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 That's accurate. Yeah. There is that. You think hero can die in the last reel is what is the line. And yeah, I drew on that. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. It's a salute to that. In terms of the musicians and stuff, I wanted to do something that was I wanted to write like a lot of Caribbean writers. You try to write the great Caribbean novel. You try to write the Caribbean novel that captures the whole Caribbean, and that's what I was trying to do. And that's why it contains so much characters and it contains so much references to other people. Because a lot of times I was writing, and if I was reading Lovelace at the time, Lovelace would end up in the novel, or if I was reading, Braithwaite, he would end up in the novel. They just, because of the way that the process of writing was very open ended. It was very, I love to, yeah, it's a strange thing. I love to include things that are happening around me physically in the time of writing into the word. So if I'm writing and I'm listening to a bit of music and I'm listening to Coltrane or I'm listening to whoever, Max Roach or whatever, they might end up in the book. They might end up in the novel. Because I like to be open to the real time trajectory, or what I call the real time trajectory of explicit love, the real time that is going on as you're writing. I like to include that in the novel. So that's why a lot of these things are in there. But also because I just wanted to talk about people that I was reading and people that I thought were interesting and important, Carpentier and Lovelace and Braithwaite and Malika Booker, Roger Robinson. They all end up in the novel, because I think it's important for people to read them and be aware of them and look them up.
I think it works, particularly in the context of historical fiction, when there's an element. I think when the musician's musing, who talks about when his father dies, all of this will disappear, and so you get the sense that the novel, in some ways, when it mentions these kind of greats, is also marking out a place of remembrance. That was how I read
Absolutely.
it, anyway.
No,
Which I
absolutely,
think,
absolutely. Because as Caribbean people, I mean, so much of our history is lost, and
Mhm.
the poets and the novelists are the ones that are creating history for us. We're creating our own. We're the ones that are sort of marking, as you say, marking space and marking existence, marking experience. So it's important to mark these people, mark these places for generations to come.
No,
It's the work. It's
absolutely.
the work to do.
As a historian, I'm often sending my students to read Caribbean historical fiction for exactly
Hmm.
that reason, that novelists and writers have
Yeah,
contributed so much to
yeah,
what we know of as Caribbean history.
absolutely.
And in some respects, I think perhaps more so than we think of, because we think of them as novelists rather than historians. But I'm
Yeah.
not going to go on my own historian tangent. I'm going to stick to actually, yeah, it's kind of on a similar note. Actually, what question I had was about footnotes. There
Hmm.
are lots of them in the novel, and you don't always see that in fiction. I think they've also been a source of some. I don't say controversy; it's not quite the word, but they've often become quite political. Whether if you're writing in your own tongue, in nation language, how much do you explain when you've got a European publisher?
Hmm.
Do you use
Hmm.
footnotes? Do you use a glossary? And you don't quite use footnotes in that way. You use them quite differently. You again,
Hmm.
you're kind of
Hmm.
marking out references. These are real songs. These are real people. You can
Yeah,
find more information
yeah.
here. How was that? Like, was that an editorial choice that you made before you spoke to your publisher? Did your publisher agree with it? Is it part of the kind of crazy serious? Is it a novel? Is it an academic text vibe you've gone for? By the way, for the readers, watchers, this is a lot more fun than we're making it sound. It doesn't feel like an academic text, and but the footnotes are kind of like, oh, we've got into a different genre a little bit. So how did that come about? Why did you choose to include footnotes in your novel?
I've used that a lot. I mean, even in African origins, I use footnotes. I like the idea of using footnotes that take you somewhere else, that surprise you, that they don't necessarily explain, they expand. So that's what I like to do. I like to, like for instance, gosh, I mean, in African origins, I talk about the bomb. I talk about, oh, the steel band dropped the bomb. And then the footnote, you might expect it to be about an explosion or bomb, but it's actually about the competition called the bomb competition in the 60s and the 70s, where a steel pan had to play a pop song. So it goes on to the history of that. So it surprises the reader. And in a political way, I think you're right that I don't use footnotes or glossaries. I'm completely against that because when I read Joyce or I don't know or Henry James, they don't give me a glossary. So I'm not going to give readers a glossary. But what I am going to give them is maybe a story within a story in the footnote. So a lot of the footnotes function as other stories. There's an African American author called Samuel Delaney that uses a similar technique. If people are interested, they could look at his book Atlantis, in which he does that, in which the footnotes become a whole other story. A lot of people, a lot of people do this. I love it. I think maybe it's a postmodernist technique. It's sort of multiple layers of storytelling. You know.
All right. We have time for one yes and no question, and I'm really sorry for putting this to you.
Okay.
But do you have any plans to convert the podcast on the Bocas Lit Fest website into an audiobook?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I have to just sit down with my publisher, with People Tree to talk about how we're going to do it. But I think it's going to end up on either Spotify or Bandcamp, hopefully by the end of the year. Yeah, absolutely. So people are going to be able to download and do whatever. The only reason it hasn't been there yet. It's just my sort of busyness and lack of a focus to sit down and actually get it done. But it's ready to go. It's ready to go. So hopefully by the end of the year, fingers crossed, it will be available in that
Yeah,
way.
that was part.
But it's like
That's part
20.
request, part petition, really.
It's 20 hours of music though. It's a
I'm
long.
I'm I'm so excited
Crazy.
by that answer because I so wanted that. I so wanted the audio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I listened to part of
Yeah.
it on audio, and it definitely needs a playlist function or an audiobook. It's such a
Yeah.
magical
Yeah.
way.
Absolutely.
It's a completely different way of interacting with the text. I
Mm.
have to be honest. When I listen to the audiobook, sorry, you said like we've got a minute, and I'm like, let me just talk some more though. But I will say, it brought the characters alive in a completely different way. When I read the text
Right.
afterwards, I was like, oh wow, it's really, it feels different. But I
Yeah.
loved the audiobook. I'm absolutely looking forward to seeing it and
Great.
hearing it
Thank
in
you.
full.
All right.
Yeah.
I think
Cool.
that was the probably the happiest note that we can end this interview on. Thank you so much, Anthony. We absolutely
You're welcome.
absolutely loved the book and
Pleasure.
loved discussing it. I guess I
Thank
could
you.
also throw in here
Thanks
that
for
I
reading it.
absolutely loved Kitchen Sonnets for Albert, but that's just me.
Yeah.
All right. So what we'll do now, we'll
Thank you.
take a reading from Anthony Joseph, and the next time you see us, we'll be reflecting on Astrid Romer's On a Woman's Madness. Thank you for joining us, and have a lovely day.
I'm going to read chapter 27 of The Frequency of Magic. Luke shelters in the awning of the ice shop. He had trained his body to withstand stress and wait for water to pass. Abandoned by his mother, but how come the same mother bawling to keep him close? When women give away children, they don't brace so. But the further she carry him down Ramki soon traced that brittle afternoon, the wider her terror grow, like cancer, or hole for urinary catheter that they insert. Though that far June she was not to know how she herself would die, with no anesthesia. Luke appeared fearless, bearded, so primitive in gesture that he ate steak with a spoon and spat the gizzard out. He had long left behind the mundane ambitions of less successful protagonists. It is true that once a country bookie rubbed a wasp nest in his eye, and when the time came to fight, Luke was reticent and shy with the instruments of death. But let us not imagine that Luke, taken on this pilgrimage to the palm-swept shores of the island's oldest copra plantation, was not aware of his own character, of his own arc and driven river, of his own strength in this struggle over his portion of the plot. He had run away from the big book as he had run away from an orphanage, with no motive besides the urge to run until his free paper burned. No, Luke, not stupid. The rain paused, and he moved further east to a village beside the sea. There, in a clearing, in an amphitheater of grass and bony rock, a stage had been raised, and a saxophonist wearing a white cotton shirt, a black silken tie, and blue wasp waist trousers was leading his quartet through a modal version of Ron Berridge's Afrolypso. Luke sat down on a big stone, watching as water ran from the outcrops, seeing the ibises in watercolor red standing knee-deep, foraging in the tender grass. The saxophonist stood boldly upright to blow his horn, and the sound was flung up against the sky. He came now with another tune, Weariness of the Blues, long worn suffering as wise as jazz. The saxophonist wept and spoke notes from the bell. Luke sat on the promontory and watched the band. The drummer's kick could be felt in the earth, and the bass man was Daddy Stone. Expect magic. The sun began slowly to reveal its brightness upon the waterlogged land. On the other side of the amphitheater, high on its summa cavea, Luke saw the great bandit rise from his seat and dust off his eyes. The bandit seemed to stare directly across the arena at Luke. His light years had taken, but when that eye reached, it piercing. The bandit began to examine the gap between them. He wanted to bridge the distance. He wanted to see his friend. The saxophonist shakes the spit from his horn. Then he plays Lord Blakey's Maria, but angular, dread. By now, the great bandit's malice was motivated by wickedness, besides his desire to unravel the secrets Luke kept. Though it remained his remit to pursue the protagonist, he was now damn vexed and primarily concerned with separating Luke's gizzard from his navel. He felt disrespected. He wanted to be a star boy too. His leap across the valley was ferocious, the black cape sailing up, the fingers extending into claws, the mouth snarling. Luke braced to fight, but changed his mind and tacked back uphill along the cliff face and gully drop, high above the shores of a mighty ocean, tumbling and hissing out his lung. The great bandit allied hard in Luke's path with a power that shook the morning ground. The big man laughed, his face half in shadow under the loquacious brim of his 10-gallon hat, which he pinched at the tip in the Cuban style. They both lingered in the gaze a while as the surf roared below them. Then the bandit flung his first callous blow, a bold chain flinging out, determined to tangle and pop, and it hit Luke Francomen on his jaw. Thunder shook again, rain, but the sun remained hard in the sky. To tangle with the younger man, the bandit must task out his weaponry. So he bring rope with a hook this time. Luke must now be agile. He cannot depend on his skill as a Dan in Shotokan. The bandit is more experienced in martial arts, and he ox strong and bitter in the mouth. He know big stone and kick up, even kick up with cutlass, but he know shotgun too. Luke jumped down, like to run off the road to avoid head-on collision, like driving in Tobago one time when he uses to smoke. Better jump than be beat upon by the faster blade. But the bandit fuffle him up with the rope and tie him in several knots. Then he dragging him behind like a sack of wheat or a sloth caught on land. He carry him down to the basement shebeen, where the sea seep into stone in the back of Los Eros Bay. He meant to crush Luke to must, to open the great lies and locks of prose and plot, to reveal how a butcher on such a hill, who matriculate from no college or creed, who read no Carpentier, Brodber, or Susan Césaire, and yet could sculpt a book which pressed against the limits of the infinite, a book which held them both as within prison walls. By torturing secrets from the younger man, the great bandit hoped to free himself from his own arc and death within the parameters of the pages the old man wrote, and those he was yet to write. A text which kept solid and true to the way things went, as plot and thesis, as villain or hex or ciphers unseen by Western causality. From the perils of good and the processes of evil, to dash away Hemingway and Henry James and praise Earl Lovelace instead.